The 1700 census of the island most likely included the Fedon family. Pierre Feron was a white Catholic Frenchman who lived on about 5,600 acres in the parish of St. Mark. He married an ex-slave named Bridget, and therefore his children were considered coloreds. A 1763 census identifies him as owning a small coffee plantation with 3 slaves. One of his sons, Julien Fedon, later also marries a colored woman named Marie Rose. He owned a large plantation named Belvedere in the mountainous regions of the parish of St. John. When the French occupied the island, the free coloreds or mulattoes were accorded political, military, religious, and economic privileges equivalent to the whites. With the assumption of the British rule, these rights were eroded or systematically taken away and reserved for British citizens only. Diplomatic and other negotiation attempts by the free coloreds were at first somewhat successful, but later stymied and reversed until it was quite evident that they would be forever relegated to the role of second-class citizens. This meant that they could no longer practice their Catholic religion, vote, or hold office. Land grants and other financial incentives attracted white settlers from Britain and its other dominions. This served to accelerate the growth of plantations and, accordingly, the importation of slaves on the island. Between 1763 and 1772, there were 700 acres planted in cocoa, almost 13,000 acres planted in coffee, and 32,000 acres planted in sugarcane, almost rivaling Barbados and Jamaica. Naturally, the frustrations of the free coloreds led to increasing resentment and finally, open rebellion. This bit of history is important to note because it dispels some commonly held beliefs that the Fedon Rebellion was initiated to free the slaves. In fact, its genesis was a class uprising pitting the freed coloreds and white Frenchmen against the new British rulers. It was a means to restore the rights of the free French coloreds on the island. Although Fedon was inspired by the initial French Revolution's abolition of slavery in 1794 and stated his intention to make Grenada a black republic like Haiti, based on the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, he himself owned many slaves and did not free them until the eve of his rebellion, so that they could join his rebellious forces. In effect, the slaves became a pawn in Fedon's rebellion, but they were obviously willing pawns. It is clear that Fedon was indeed sympathetic to the cause of emancipation, but apparently found it difficult to relinquish his privileges without a threat to his own personal dignity and livelihood. Fedon and his fellow French coloreds plotted their rebellion in secret and with the support of sympathetic French coloreds on the neighboring islands, including Martinique. The slaves were not involved in the planning process, but their free labor was leveraged to help fortify the mountainside estate that would later become the camp from which the uprising would be launched. Of course, not all French free coloreds felt aggrieved enough to force them to participate in an uprising that would overthrow the British and the existing status quo. A 1790 transcript from a British official in England suggests that Captain Louis Le Grand would be a reliable British ally. The transcript reads in part, "I have had some conversation with Louis Le Grand, a mulatto of this colony, of considerable property, well known for many years and upon many occasions for his active services against the runaway Negroes. He is now employed in suggesting this idea to his friends, over whom he has great influence, from his character, property, and situation as captain of a colored company attached to the St. George Regiment. On the night of March 2nd, 1795, the moon was more than 90% illuminated, but not yet a full moon. Just after midnight, Fedon's rebels marched 6 miles and launched an attack in the town of La Baye, now Grenville, in the parish of St. Andrews. It was a vicious and bloody attack. Homes were broken into and individuals were shot and savagely massacred with cutlasses and other weapons. The viciousness of the attack may be an indication of the hostility the ex-slaves and coloreds felt towards the treatment under the British. One letter by a British colonist reported that the rebels not only murdered in cold blood every man they could find, but cut and mangled their unhappy victims with all the wanton cruelty which savage ferocity could devise. A simultaneous but less bloody attack was orchestrated 2.5 miles away in Charlottetown, now Guelph, in the parish of St. John. This operation resulted in the capture of the town's men. The total number of hostages grew to 51 as they marched them to the steep mountainous interior of Fedon's Belvedere camp. Among the hostages was Ninian Home, the lieutenant governor, whom you would recall had written the letter to his overseer regarding the ill treatment of the slaves on his Paraclete plantation. An account of the attack on March 2nd, 1795 is found in a letter by a British government representative who survived the attack. It reads as follows: My Lord Duke, I have great concern in acquainting your grace that a general insurrection of the French free colored people broke out in the island on the night of the 2nd instant, and commenced by the massacre of the English white inhabitants at Grenville Bay, and the seizure of the persons of the English white inhabitants of Charlottetown and on several estates in the country. The lieutenant governor had gone on the afternoon of the 2nd to the windward side of the island, and in attempting to return next morning to St. George's by water, was unfortunately captured by the insurgents of Charlottetown, in consequence of which it became necessary for me to assume the command as senior resident member of His Majesty's Council. A failed attempt by British regiments to rescue the hostages on April 8, 1795, resulted in the execution by the rebels of 48 of the hostages, including Lieutenant Governor Ninian Home. They were taken one by one from the coffee boucan where they were held and summarily shot to death. Between March 1795 and June 1796, Fedon and his rebels controlled all of Grenada except the parish of St. George. It is estimated that over 14,000 slaves, about half the slave population, joined the rebellion, although a much smaller number fought on the side of the British. Some slaves were utilized for reconnaissance purposes. Others were armed with guns, but the majority were armed with cutlasses and other crude weapons. Much of the destruction that was realized after the rebellion was the result of slaves burning down estates and otherwise performing terroristic acts against their former owners. As a young child, I recall my father regaling me with stories of Fedon and his rebels. One such folklore was that Fedon would have the shoes on his horse placed backwards on the hooves so as to fool the British as to his location and whereabouts. Things began to turn in favor of the British in March 1796 when they captured Post Royal and Pilot Hill in St. Andrews. It was a strategic move that essentially cut off critical supplies of food and weapons to the rebels. With this and subsequent defeats, the rebels realized the inevitable, and on June 10th, offered to surrender areas of the west coast, including Guelph. The British rejected the offer, thus forcing many of the rebels to take refuge at Fedon's camp. The final British assault and victory over the less well-trained and equipped rebels came in June 1796. Despite the victory at the camp, it took the British another 15 months and 16 military units supplemented with hired troops to finally root out many of the rebels who were putting up armed resistance in the countryside. Hundreds of soldiers were lost to disease and fighting, but in the end, 50 rebels were captured. 35 were found guilty of treason and publicly executed in what is now the open-air market in St. George's. Their severed heads were then publicly displayed as a warning to others. The remaining rebels were either imprisoned or expelled from the island. Fedon himself was never caught, and his fate is unknown to this day. Some speculate that he escaped to Trinidad or drowned at sea while trying to escape. The abolition of slavery in the British Caribbean was a gradual process. Several factors led to its abolition. It was not just a simple matter of wealthy planters, politicians, and businessmen suddenly growing a conscience and realizing that the system was inhumane, hypocritical, and corrupting to all parties concerned. Although this cannot be discounted entirely. In fact, owners and traders were unwilling to give up their wealth and privilege if there was a way to avoid doing so. Where there was a will, there was a way. However, certain realities began to overshadow their monetary desires. There was the economic reality. By the early 1800s, sugarcane production was in decline and plantation owners were beginning to suffer financially. Some owners would return to Britain and leave their plantations to be run by overseers. There was the realization that there was a basic inefficiency in labor and production that did not allow the British West Indies to compete with other sugar-producing countries such as Brazil and Cuba. And this resulted in higher costs for sugar in Britain. As the sugar industry went into further decline, the British Parliament felt less pressure to support and protect the interests of sugar plantation owners. There was the political reality. The winds of revolution and rebellion were everywhere, and the cost in dollars and lives was significant. There was the French Revolution of 1789 to 1794, the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, the Fedon Rebellion of 1795 to 1796, the Boussard Rebellion in Barbados in 1816, and the Samuel Sharp Rebellion in Jamaica in 1831. Toussaint was influenced by the French Revolution and Fedon by the Haitian Revolution. There was the social, moral, and religious reality. There was increasing pressure brought to bear by religious, political, and abolitionist groups in Britain and in Western society as a whole. They lobbied and demanded the end of slavery. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, which outlawed the international trading of slaves, but did not abolish slavery itself. The penalty if caught was a fine of £100 per slave, the loss of the ship, and the freedom of the slaves. The act did little to dissuade slave traders. As a follow-up, the Trade Felony Act of 1811 was introduced, which made the overseas slave trade a felony act throughout the empire. A Royal Navy squadron patrolled the west coast of Africa and between 1808 and 1860 captured over 1,600 slave ships and freed over 150,000 captured Africans. Even this did not stop the slave trade entirely. However, by this time, many traders had already stopped trading due to the growing winds of change. The December 1831 slave revolt in Jamaica, led by the Baptist minister Samuel Sharp, was suppressed in 10 days, but the cost in lives and property led to official inquiries, which in turn contributed to the abolition of slavery with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. The act did not come into full compliance until August 1st, 1834. However, only slaves below the age of 6 were freed in the colonies. Former slaves over the age of 6 were designated as apprentices, and their enslavement was abolished in 2 stages. The first set of apprenticeships came to an end on August 1st, 1838, while the final apprenticeships were scheduled to end on August 1st, 1840. With the end of slavery, 2 very contradictory things happened. One was that the former slaves were now free but had no real means to support themselves and care for their families. There was no real representation in the government, no compensation for their past labors, and no other sources of employment for most except from their former owners. Meanwhile, the British Parliament enacted the Slave Compensation Act of 1837 for the purposes of compensating the slave owners for the loss of their slaves due to the Abolition Act. The amount financed for the compensation was £20 million and was finally redeemed by the British government in 2015. The irony of these radically different situations was that the wealthy slave owners, many of whom were absentee owners, received generous reparations for their ownership of slaves, while the slaves themselves were cast free to deal with a new harsh and uncertain reality without any form of help or compensation. Of course, the plantations in the colonies still required labor-intensive work. Some former slaves returned to work on the plantations and in many cases had to endure very low wages and the same ill treatment they underwent when slavery was in effect. Other former slaves demanded better working conditions and benefits that the owners refused to agree to. Still others resorted to subsistence farming on their own. The overall effect was that there was now a shortage of labor and agricultural production was plummeting. The ready solution for the owners, though maybe not the most rational, was to import indentured servants, as was done during the French rule. Although the cost would be significantly higher than acquiescing to the simple demands of the now freed slaves, there was some resentment to agreeing to the demands of individuals who were still considered fit only for exploitative labor. Importing indentured servants from Africa, however, was probably not a good idea since it might blur the lines between slavery and servitude for those in Britain who fought to eradicate slavery. The focus turned to India, a colony of the British Empire. It was a populous nation with severe unemployment and extreme poverty, a ready workforce to be exploited. One could conceivably justify the importation of indentured servants from India as simply relocating British subjects from one geographic location to another. From the government's perspective, importing indentured servants would help further quell the illegal trade in slaves that still continued on the periphery. On January 1st, 1857, the HMS Maidstone left Calcutta, India, with 304 indentured servants and arrived 89 days later on May 1st at Owens Bay in the parish of St. Patrick with 287 passengers, a mortality rate of 6%. The following year, the Fullwood brought 362 Indians, and the Jallowa brought an additional 249 in 1859. By 1885, over 3,033 indentured Indian servants were brought to the island. Most of these indentured servants came from the Uttar Pradesh and the Buha regions of North India. On arrival, they were distributed to various plantations where they entered into contracts for up to 3 years, some extended to 5 years. They normally worked 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, and 5 hours on Saturdays, alongside the former slaves. The contract basically included free housing, a fixed basic wage of about 1 shilling, approximately 25 cents per day, rudimentary medical care, and a free return passage at the end of the contract. Some were given small plots of land if they renewed their contract. Fully 85% of the indentured servants decided to stay in Grenada and renew their contracts. As can be expected, despite the fact that certain guidelines were established to protect them from ill treatment from unscrupulous owners and overseers, many were still taken advantage of due to the fact that they were not always fully aware of the terms and intricacies of the contracts. Indentured servitude was formally ended in 1917 with the growing nationalism movement in India. When we look back at Grenada today, we see reflected the legacies of all these different groups who from the 17th century through the 20th century have either through conquest, greed, enslavement, servitude, or the opportunity to start a new life, have made Grenada their home. We see it in the patois phrases and Roman Catholic religion legacies of the French period, the Shango rituals and big drum dance brought by the slaves from West Africa, the education system and government bureaucracies of the British, the flavorful roti dishes from India, and the various skin tones resulting from the rape of slave women and the natural sexual interrelationships between the ethnic groups. This is not unlike the story of America or the other Caribbean islands. Yet still, it is interesting in that these various ethnic groups have assimilated the cultures of each other and made it their own distinct Grenadian culture, while living together on an island that is only 133 square miles.